Good. Welcome, dear friends. We are delighted for you to join us here at the National Library of Israel in Jerusalem for one more episode of Simches, our series of conversations on crises in Jewish history. Today, I was going to start with the song that many of us know, right? What do we leave? Nothing much, only Anatevka. Moving scene, touching scene at the end of Fiddler of the Roof. We're in one more exile, one more experience of having to leave one's homeland. And I think that in some ways it's interesting to think that the Jewish diaspora, the Jewish exile, it's not just one specific moment. It's a collective memory of many different exiles. Already in our few conversations, we talked about the Assyrian exile, we talked about the Babylonian exile, obviously the exile that comes after the Roman conquest, the destruction of the temple, and the oppression of the Jewish rebellions is perhaps the most famous or the most relevant to current Jewish collective consciousness and memory. But within this period of exile, within the time between the Roman conquest and the renewed Jewish sovereignty, Israeli sovereignty of the 20th century, there's been a whole series of expulsion and exiles. I'm thinking of a continued experience of exile in a way. In different generations, different Jews were exiled from different places. The Edict of Expulsion by Edward I in England in 1290, or people being exiled from smaller communities in Eastern Europe, like is depicted in Fiddler on the Roof. But I think that perhaps the most significant of these events, especially in late medieval and early modern periods, perhaps beyond the exile in the Babylonian exile or the Roman exile, is of course the exile that we are going to be discussing here today, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And to discuss the expulsion of the Jews of Spain in 1492, we are delighted to host and to have with us Dr. Aliza Moreno. Dr. Aliza Moreno is a scholar specializing in the Western Sephardic diaspora. Her work includes a book exploring the Inquisition and the new Christians of Jewish origin in South America during the colonial period. For the last 7 years, Dr. Moreno has been the head of the Judaica Collection Reading Room here at the National Library of Israel. Dr. Moreno also lectures at both the Melton Center at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Herzog College. And as mentioned, she's here today to talk to us about Gerush Tzfarad, the expulsion of Spain. Dr. Aliza Moreno, Shalom Rav.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much for joining us. And well, let's go straight for the jugular here. Perhaps you could expose the background, the historical background within which the expulsion of Jews from Spain occurred.
If you allowed me, even before talking about the background, it was very interesting the things that you mentioned in your introduction about the several expulsions and why the Spanish one was remained later in the Jewish collective memory, and I think it's a matter of two facts. First of all, it's a matter of numbers, in the terms that it is true that probably there was no place in the Middle Ages where Jews were not expelled, but when the expulsion in Spain took place, the estimation of the scholars is that more than 40% of all the Jews in the world were settled in Spain. If we make a comparison, it's more than the number of Jews living today in the United States. So it's for sure, it was a huge crisis. And the second point is that the impact and that the people that went out of Spain had in the Jewish world all around. So I think it's not by mistake that it became such an icon, such an important historical point in the Jewish history. Now coming to your question, the expulsion that it's very much known and its date 14 92. It's well known, but actually the crisis of the Jews in the peninsula, in the Iberian Peninsula, started about 100 years before that, in 1391, that there were attacks all over the peninsula, in the south, in the north, all over what we call today Spain. And after these attacks, we have testimonies of a new phenomenon that was not, didn't exist as a phenomenon in the peninsula. That was that many of the communities, or some of the communities, and many Jews were not just attacked, but they were forced to convert to Christianity. So after this year, not just that there was a huge crisis in all the aspects, but for the first time, we can see that we have a significant number of conversos. Conversos, I mean, all Jews that were forced to convert to Christianity. And now they were living side by side with regular Jews. Now, we have to take into account that we are talking about the same families, that probably part of them became Christians and other remained Jews. And it was a great challenge, of course, for the Jewish communities, and many new questions around how we deal with these converts that are no more Jews, but we are still connected. But on the other hand, it was also a great challenge for the religious and Christians authorities in the peninsula, and also the political authorities in the place, since those conversions were not out of faith, but they were forced to convert. It was quite obvious that many of them didn't want to be Christians, in spite of the fact that in theory they could have some advantage of being Christians. And this new reality also brought to a new phenomenon that not everyone, but part of these former Jews that were now Christians, they kept their Judaism in secret. That's what we can call crypto Jews, that they were still having their Jewish conscience, and they were keeping some of the Jewish customs in secret. And this new reality, probably, I say probably because that's a huge discussion among scholars, what was the reason for the Inquisition to start to being installed in Spain in such a late period. The Inquisition was a medieval institution that it was never present in Spain, but at this point, and because of these conversos from Jewish origin, it was brought and applied in Spain also.
So this would be the Inquisition setting out to try and read out who among the Conversos might actually still be practicing in secret their Judaism.
That's right. In theory, that was the main aim of the Inquisition. And it started, afterwards, they kept looking for all kinds of heresies, not just Judaism. But at the beginning, the Inquisition in Spain came to look after these conversos that were suspected that probably were keeping their Judaism. So two important points to say. First of all, Inquisition was not looking after Jews. It was looking after Christians, that they were suspected of becoming any kind of heresy, and not especially Jews. Okay, so in this period of the time that they were both Jews and conversos, the Inquisition was mainly looking after the conversos and not the Jewish people. And the second point, I mentioned before that there was a scholarly, still are some discussions why the Inquisition started working in Spain. And there are some voices that said that, no, actually the Jews who converted, they in fact were assimilated and were part of the Spanish society at this point. The Inquisition started working in 1480 in Spain, and they said no, there were actually regular Christians, but the main motive of the Inquisition was not religious, but political or economically. They were still looking after these peoples that they were faithful to Christianity, but they were not so accepted and welcomed in the Spanish society of the time.
So Jews who would choose to convert themselves, hoping to escape the violence and the oppression that their status as Jews brought upon them by becoming Christian, were still not accepted by the more widespread Spanish Christian community.
And it was complicated because there were many limitations for the Jews in terms of their ability to become a full part of the nation as far as they were Jews. But after they were converted, at least at the beginning, many of these limitations were absolved because they were now Christians. And so there were several processes that took place in Spain. One was the appearance of the Inquisition, and other was that there appeared new regulations of purity of blood. That it's very much in contrast to the original ideology of Christianity. In Christianity, once you are a Christian, you're an equal.
We are all one under Christ.
Exactly. No, but in Spain we can see that there were many limitations for people who were from Jewish origin. I mean, even if they were not born Jews, but they came from a originally Jewish family, but now even if they were born Christians, they were very much limited to do many things. So it was also it came from the bottom, from the social, that they were still segregated, and it was also pressure from above, institutions like Inquisition and other rules.
It is also claimed by some scholars that this the emergence of this notion of the purity of the blood, because of the particularities of the Jewish situation in Spain at the time, where they converted but they were still looked at with suspicion and discriminated against. This notion of the purity of the blood is in a way the precursor of what we think of as modern racism. The hatred towards Jews is not about their religion, but it becomes about their ethnicity, which, according to some people, is what characterizes modern racism as opposed to more ancient forms of tribalism or xenophobia.
I think there's some truth in this argumentation, but we have to be cautious because it was not Nazism, okay? So we are still not talking about the same grade of discrimination as we saw afterwards under the Nazi German regime. So it is true that it was new because it was not just an issue of being Jews. The stigma was still very relevant even after the conversion, but it's not the same as the real modern racism that we unfortunately know so well.
There's another term, we talked about the Inquisition, we talked about Conversos. There's another term we discussed before we started filming our conversation, Marranos. Usually I've heard that term used for what you called crypto Jews. Could you talk to us about that term, Marranos?
Okay, the term Marranos is actually very popular. I believe that much more in the modern period than in the actual historical time. In my opinion, I don't like it very much because the meaning in Spanish, it's a pejorative term. Marranos, it's pigs. It's obviously a pejorative term, but in terms of the meaning, it means the people the Jews that were converted and kept their Jewish conscience, identity, customs. I prefer to use crypto Jews. But when we discuss in a more general level the phenomenon, I think it's better to use concepts as conversos, converts, or new Christians of Jewish origins, because in fact, it's very hard to know today among this huge group of people how many of them actually kept a Jewish identity after conversion. Even Inquisition, we cannot be sure that everyone that was on trial under the Inquisition, that he actually was a crypto Jew. It's very hard to say. Once we define them in a more general, more like the social profile of the people, so we know that part of them, they kept their Jewish identity, but on the other hand, there were many of them that they were very truly part of the Christian Spanish society, and it's better, in my opinion, to call them conversos or crypto Jews.
You mentioned from the rise in discrimination, in attacks, in violence in 1391, you had this wave of conversos. Some of them were crypto Jews, some of them embraced Christianity, but other Jews kept their lives as Jews. And then you talked about how it could divide really families, where some people convert, some people stay Jewish. They keep living, I guess, in the same geographic environment. How come, if people converted, how come Jews were allowed to remain Jewish before the expulsion? You would expect that this wave of conversions means that it becomes extremely difficult or almost impossible to maintain a Jewish existence and a Jewish identity in Spain. But you're telling us that some Jews kept being Jewish in the same communities as others converted. So it was still possible for Jewish people to maintain a Jewish life and a Jewish identity in 14th century Spain?
It's a very interesting question, because on the one hand, there's no doubt that starting from 1391, there was a real crisis for the Jewish existence in the Iberian Peninsula. But on the other hand, we know that not just that there were still normative Jews going around, that communities even flourished and kept writing, and they even became more in numbers in the demographic terms. There was an increasing tendency. For giving a specific example that's relevant to the National Library, it's very interesting that even in this challenging period, Spain was one of the first places in the world where Jews printed material in Hebrew. Even they had like 10 years before the expulsion that the technology was available in Spain, and they printed. We have some interesting works printed in Spain before they went out. So somehow the Jews, even in spite of the crisis, they continue living a full Jewish life, and they were fine there. At the time that there were still Inquisitions and all these challenges that we mentioned before.
Take us then to 1492, that iconic date for maybe you'll tell us a seemingly unrelated but actually kind of related reason, right? The discovery by Columbus, but also the date of the expulsion of the Jews. Why, after this discrimination, after the increasing attack, why like another watershed moment? What happens in 1492? Well,
let's remember that in general, they were fighting, we can tell, political, religious war in Spain that was in the process of Reconquista. Part of Spain were still under Muslim political sovereignty. So the kings of Spain were trying to put together their political authority and the fact that all Spain should be Christian. We are we know that also Muslims were expelled from Spain. So of course, this war was part of the reasons for the expulsions of the Jews, and to that we should add all the tension that was with the Conversos, and the fact that having Jews still in the peninsula allowed these Conversos to learn, to know, to have a live contact to their Judaism, their origins. So it was a mixture of reasons, and the Crises in 1492 was in some aspects similar to the one 100 years before, in the terms that here we are now have a new wave of conversions. Many Jews chose and decided to convert to Christianity in this point and not to leave the peninsula. But on the other hand, they were able to choose to stay, but to convert to Christianity or to leave the peninsula. Now, we must understand that it was a very difficult decision to leave. It's not like today that we know we can just take our luggages and go into a plane and go anywhere else. There were hundreds of years living in Spain. They were very much part of the culture, and they were absolutely uncertain what will happen to them when they go out. There were also elder people, young people, that the travel was very much challenging, and it was a very hard decision to take. So when we say that there was a decision to take, it's complicated, because to stay in sometimes what's not just because they really started believing in Christianity, but sometimes they have a really some strong difficulties that it was almost impossible to choose to live. But in terms of the possibility of choosing, we can mention afterwards the difference between the Spanish case and the Portuguese case, that was very much close in time, but very much different in terms of the real possibility of choosing.
Could you elaborate on this point?
From the expulsion from Spain, the great majority moved to Portugal. It was the easiest, the closest in terms of not just geography, but also culture. The second, after Portugal, another important group moved to North Africa, and a smaller but very important group moved to the Ottoman, what eventually went to the Ottoman Empire. But regarding the Portuguese, they were the big majority. Now, about the question of Portugal. A couple years after the expulsion from Spain, they were trying to get a marital between the monarchy in Spain, the monarchy in Portugal. But the Spanish side said, okay, we can move forward, but we cannot allow that you have Jews in Portugal. The problem was that in Portugal, in these few years, the Jews that came from Spain and the original Jews that were in the place became a very important part of the local society, not just in terms of number. The estimation is that they were even at 10% of the general people in Portugal, but also they became very central and important in the economic side of the activities of Portugal. In Portugal, they were in a big dilemma because they could not allow themselves to expel their Jews, but they were very much willing to get into this contract with Spain. So in theory, they applied an expulsion, but in fact, it was not an expulsion. They could not leave, but there was a huge forced conversion of Jews in Portugal. And that's why the phenomenon is so different in Portugal and in Spain. Because in Portugal, it was not a result of a decision. They were forced to convert to Christianity, and they stayed in the same places. And not just that, but also the Inquisition started working in Portugal just several decades after the expulsion, the perceived conversion of the Jews in Portugal. As a consequence, we can see that many of the groups that we know, individuals that we learn later about them, that they kept actually their Jewish identity, they are much more from Portugal than from Spain. It was very, very close in time, but very different phenomenon.
How does exile actually look like? Take us to kind of the lived reality of the Spanish expulsion for a Spanish family that makes the decision not to convert. They leave Spain, they go to Portugal or to the Ottoman Empire or to Morocco, what is now Morocco. How does it actually look like? Are they allowed to sell their possessions? Are they allowed to take some of these possessions with them? Do they know where they're going to? Do they have any idea how they're going to manage in this new life they're trying to find? How does it look like for actual Jewish families?
I think that you actually reflected in your question. There was a lot of uncertainty in this point. In terms of their possessions, they were able to take with them very few things, and of course, they tried to sell their homes, their possessions, but the population knew that they had to leave. So if they paid very few. So for sure, it was an economic radical crisis for everyone who left Spain. That's for sure. That was kind of the challenging and the difficulty of taking the decision of leaving Spain. Regarding where to go and the different process that they had to pass, it depends where they went. Those that we mentioned that were the majority, that they went to Portugal, it was in theory easier. I cannot say that it was easy because it was not, but easier because they were able to move by land. No need to take other transportation fields. So the travel was challenging. It was easier, and they were very much welcomed in Portugal. The other people that went to the east, it was much more uncertain. They went out to Spain, and they were not sure where they would be welcome to settle. Some of them had spent some time in Italy, but they could not settle there. Many of them actually went and they spent a significant period of time just looking and moving one place to another. Also, it is interesting that in many cases, in this period of time, that it's different from the second wave of immigrants related to the expulsion of Spain that we might mention afterwards in the 17th century. After the expulsion, most of the Jews actually went to existing Jewish communities. In many cases, they became prominent even if they were the new immigrants. For example, in North Africa, before the expulsion, there were Jewish communities in North Africa, but Spain was the reference. When they want to have instruct their rabbis, they were sent to Spain. I mean, Spain was seen as the central cultural and spiritual center. So when the Jewish expelled from Spain came into this community, usually when you have immigrants societies, they are like the lower, the more...
The lower echelons of society.
Exactly, but in this case, probably they were, in terms of economical terms, they were probably poor. But on the other hand, they have the knowledge, they have the authority, and very, very fast they became the leaders. For example, we know that many of the local customs became the Spanish customs more than the local ones. They became very much prominent. That's very clear in North Africa, sorry. And also in the Ottoman empires, there were different communities that were recognized from not just Spain, but the specific city where they came from. So it was the Catalonian community and the Zaragoza community. So there were increases, but in a very fast way, they became very strong in the new communities in all the aspects.
I would like, in a way, to go back to what you opened with, these two aspects of the expulsion from Spain that make it a particularly memorable and a particularly poignant juncture of Jewish history, the numbers and the impact. Just to return to the numbers so that we have kind of a more direct sense of the drama. You said it was how many percentage of the...
According to Beinart, let's start with something very important. Demographics, numbers, are problematic in historical perspective. I mean, today we have more scientific and exact numbers and data. When we talk about numbers during this period of time, it's very challenging to get actually to a specific
There's
number.
An estimation or
an
speculative
not
aspect.
just that it's an estimation, that it's very common that there are very different perspectives from different scholars' points of view. If someone is interested in getting more specific numbers and related to the expulsion of Spain, David Gitlitz, in his book Secrecy and Deceit, in the introduction chapters, he brings many of these discussions. So I'll bring some numbers, but we should take this like very much with cautions.
Estimates.
Yeah, absolutely. So regarding what Beinart said is that about 40% of the world Jewry of the time was, before the expulsion, in Spain. There's a big debate how many Jews converted in 1391, how many converted were before the expulsion. The scholars, as Netanyahu said, that in the time of the expulsion, probably there were 1,600 converted. Probably there were much less. Regarding the number of Jews that were expelled, the numbers are from 50,000 Jews that went out after the expulsion. These are the smaller numbers. And other scholars, as Ber and also Beinart, they point out more like 150, even to 200,000 Jews that went out of Spain after the expulsion.
So you're saying, in terms of numbers, we're talking, which is a huge amount of people. It's a mass event, right? Especially with the different transportation technology of the time. Between 50 and 150 or even 200,000 people is a huge and probably unprecedented exile in terms of its pure sheer numbers in Jewish history. And in some ways, we can only think of how many Jewish communities after the 15th, the 16th century are really rooted in these people. And in that sense, it might be part of the explanation for why it is such a memorable expulsion among so many.
I absolutely agree. And again, I come back to the starting point. It was also an issue of numbers and also an issue of impact, because among these Jews that went out, not just that they were in huge numbers and get into so many places, but they also had a very important impact, and they were also very creative. We know of several areas in the Jewish life that we know today that actually started from these people. For giving a couple examples, in the area of the halacha, Jewish law, we have the biggest Yosef Karo, the Shulchan Aruch. He was from his family came from Spain. Or another example, all the Kabbalah that started in Tzfat at the time. They were all people, all the settled in Ottoman Tzfat and Eretz Israel of the time. They came from Spain originally. We feel till today the impact of these tendencies. Or another example, all
and
the
also maybe
Ladino.
the importance of the theme of exile and of God exiling himself from himself.
Absolutely.
And the way that theme is so ingrained in the Kabbalah of Ottoman Eretz Israel, that must be related to the trauma, the lived experience of these people.
Of course. Not just that they succeed keeping their cultural flourishing, but of course there was impact into the contents of the different aspects and subjects and way of addressing the different, ways of looking at life and challenge of lives. And for mentioning another areas that we know about the Ladino culture. The Ladino that as a language is very much similar to Spanish, but as a culture and as a language itself, it actually developed after the expulsion. There was those expelled Jews that kept talking this old Spanish and develop all the culture and all the writings more in the Ottoman Empire in different spaces in Greece and Turkey from today. This all came from Spain. Even today, it's interesting that because all of the communities that are even for Arab origin, many of them call themselves Sephardim, even if they come from, Egypt or Iran or Iraq. There's a conscience of the Sephardic Jewry that those communities were they existed much before the expulsion, but after the expulsion, the impact of the Jews that were exposed, it make a big difference, a big after and before and after.
So you find, for example, that Sfarad, for our English-speaking audience, Spain, the Sephardic Jewry, the fact that the name is Spanish Jewry, in spite of the fact that many of these communities predate by hundreds, if not thousands of years, the expulsion of Spanish Jews, shows the significance of the cultural impact.
Absolutely. I'm sure that with no the expulsion, probably we would not have this concept of a Sephardic Jewry. They came from Spain, not just those that were especially in Spain, but much bigger and different spaces and geographically and cultural.
I wanted to take you to conclude our conversation to something I think that you're already touching on in your latest remarks, and really to think about if we take a step back and we look at this event, in this series, in Simches, in this series of conversations, we are trying to reflect on the significance various crises have had and keep on having on the shaping and the development of Jewish culture, Jewish identity today. I think some of your remarks already indicate, the lingering importance of the Spanish expulsion on Jewish identity today, on the Sephardic Jewish identity in particular. What other ways do you think this momentous event of the late 15th century, what other reverberations would you say this event has in current Jewish identity, Jewish culture, or Jewish religion?
Well, I think, first of all, the main decision to leave your home in order to keep your Jewish identity is very, very strong. And they took this not just with them, but they also succeed to keep this message for future generations. The idea of keeping your identity in spite of the difficulties. I also am sure that all these difficulties encourage many of these expelled Jews to building their new communities, to keep learning, keep writing. And I think it's not just in this specific historic episode, but from difficult times, people many times get many forces that they were even not aware of them. Something that we didn't mention, but in this context, I think it's also important, is that we mainly talk about the first wave of immigration immediately after the expulsion. But we should mention at least that from the big groups of conversos that remained in the peninsula after the expulsion, in the end of the 16th, mainly in the 17th century, there was a new possibility for these people to leave the peninsula, and many of them did so, and some of them, they decided to come back to normative Judaism after more than 100 years that they were in fact disconnected from Jewish origins. What it is important to mention it because this second wave of immigration, that it's known the Sephardic, Western Sephardic diaspora, they were actually the origin of new communities that were not they were not just before that. Cases as Amsterdam, we mentioned, and Hamburg.
The famed philosopher and a dear friend of mine, Baruch Spinoza, whose family was crypto-Jewish for more than 100 years. I think it's 107 or 115 years. A family originally from Spain, moved to Portugal, kept their Judaism hidden, and then rekindled an open Jewish life in Amsterdam. They came in through France and then Den Haag and then Amsterdam, where of course you had a big Portuguese synagogue. It still stands today, the big Portuguese Jewish community, which in his case, of course, he was expelled from in 1656. But there was a very successful, very prominent, very rich, both economically and culturally, community, Portuguese community or Spanish Portuguese community in Amsterdam. And also in the context we were saying, it's interesting to see that for them to be able to rekindle a communal Jewish life, they had to bring in rabbis from communities that had been able to live as Jews openly. They had to learn again how to be Jewish and how to have a Jewish communal life.
That's right. Spinoza, it's unique, but the phenomenon, it's not so unique. And you're absolutely right. It's one example of many families that decided to went out from the peninsula, and they created their own communities. Amsterdam is one. It was the biggest community, but there are also other examples you mentioned at the beginning of your introduction, the expulsion from England. So the Jews were able to settle again in England because of these groups. The first modern Jewish community was of these Portuguese Jews that were Conversos, and they settled They were able to settle in England and other places.
Menashe ben Israel.
Exactly.
In 1656 convinced Cromwell to allow Jews back in.
That's right. And Menashe ben Israel it's a good example also of something that you mentioned, that it's truth that at the beginning these communities they settled in places where there were no Jewish communities on the place. And they were very much willing to learn and to be a Jewish community. So at the beginning, they had the need to bring rabbis, but very quickly they were able to have their own and local rabbis as Menashe ben Israel. They did a great job in very, very fast creating their communities. They have many peculiarities because they had a strong and rich background from their experience in the peninsula. And as we mentioned before, they were disconnected from Judaism more than 100 years. That means that any of them was born as Jews. All of them were born as Christians, and they decided to come back to something that they never went before, in fact, but the older generations. So that's another very interesting phenomenon directly related to the expulsion of the Jews.
I've also heard, but I'll have to double check scholarly-wise, that the famous fish and chips, British dish, fried fish is something that may have been brought to England by these new communities of Portuguese Jews.
Okay, I have no idea, but I hope you're right. It would be a
So
a
if
great
it is
invention.
the case, you know, well, I don't know, maybe it might be worthwhile in some ways. It's such an, well, I'm vegan, I don't eat fish and chips anymore, but when I used to, I liked it. So you're saying the reverberations of the expulsion of Spain that are still have a foundational role, if you will, in the way we think of Jewish culture and identity today, is this ethos of rather leaving than assimilating, rather leaving than losing your culture, this insistence, this stiff-necked insistence on maintaining your Jewish heritage, your Jewish religion. Also, the apparition of a whole wide range of new Jewish communities in Amsterdam, in England, in the Ottoman Empire, in North Africa, in a renewed, as well as their cultural impact throughout the world in a way. So we could think, if we always say in this series that a crisis, from the Greek krinien, to distinguish, to differentiate, like a critique that differentiates good books from bad books, a crisis differentiates one era from another era. The post-Spanish expulsion era is, in that sense, Spanish expulsion is a real crisis because Judaism afterwards is a changed Judaism. And in many ways, perhaps we could say that Judaism as we know it today is post-exilic, talking about that specific exile rather than others.
I absolutely agree. I think the impact of the expulsion, it's difficult to say that it's all positive or that it's absolute, the idea of the identity against the difficulties and the challenges. But I really believe that at the end, there were many, not just were, even today, we have many positive echoes of this historical tragedy, that of course it wasn't a tragedy, that it might give us some hope even under these difficult times that we are living today, hoping to get some strength even from the more challenging moments of times.
Dr. Aliza Moreno, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for sharing of your research, of your knowledge, of your wisdom with us so generously in such a good-spirited way. We're very grateful for your time. And thank you very much to our holy audience, Akala Kadosh Elanu, here at the Of Simches series of conversations. We are reflecting on the significance of crisis in Jewish history. I very much hope you enjoyed this conversation, the ones we've already recorded, the ones that we will hopefully record in the future. And in the meantime, sei gesund, only health, only good news, if possible, of Simches. And thank you very much. Hope to see you soon.